my pleasure to welcome you all today. I would like to thank you for joining us today for this special sharing on high-quality service learning, engaging community in development and evaluation, a key learning point that nearly all higher education and service learning stakeholders would want to gain. Before we start, please be reminded that your mobile phones should be shifted to silent mode. At this time, I would like to invite our honorable guest, Dr. Robert SHUMER, who is currently the Research Associate of University of Minnesota, U.S., to come forward and begin our section. Dr. SHUMER, please.
Thank you very much. Everybody can hear? I usually have a bad joke at the beginning by saying that I have a very soft voice. And when I would call friends, their answering machines would hang up on me. And my friends would call me back and say, Rob, there was nothing on my machine, so we knew you called. So microphones are helpful. Well, thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to be here in Hong Kong and to hopefully share some information and also to learn from you, because there's so many wonderful things going on in Hong Kong and all across Asia. What I'd like to do, so I should learn how to do this first. Okay. The danger of asking somebody who's 71 to do electronics is a little problematic. Anyhow, I would like to give you a basic overview of the presentation in terms of introductions and just talk a little bit about learning, and you could read the rest of it. But I'm hoping that we'll get a chance to have time toward the end to have some more active discussion. I have a little project for you to design a service learning program, so we'll have a little activity. I'm always amazed that people who talk about the value of experiential learning talk for an hour and a half and have no experience, so I hope I won't do that. And if I fall asleep in the middle, please wake me. In terms of introductions, how many of you are faculty? How many are students? Students? Community members? Others? What's the other category? Community agencies, NGOs? What? Oh, OSL, so you work in the Office of Service Learning. Okay. All right, so we have a lot of friendly people. My orientation, to just talk a little bit, is I'm a little strange in the service learning world. There's an old notion in the United States called jack of all trade, master of none, somebody who's done a million different things. Just briefly, I started as a school teacher. He taught a lot of subjects. In fact, I taught a subject called Urban Workshop in 1972, where students went out into the community to do urban work, part of social studies. But what was unique in my experience was in the 1970s, and one of the things I'll reiterate throughout the conversation is there's nothing new. Everything that you think is new has been done 10 times, you just aren't aware of it. But there was an initiative in the United States called Experience-Based Career Education. And the theme was, you take somebody's interest, so I would ask students, what are you passionate about? And then we would develop the entire curriculum around their area of passion. And so I use an example of a young lady who was interested in animals. She wanted to be a veterinarian. She spent 3 full days a week in an animal shelter. Now, this is high school. 3 full days a week she was not in school. In fact, her pre-calculus class, teacher said she'd never pass the class because she only went 2 days a week. We developed a curriculum around animal physiology. So there was a textbook, there were tests. She was working with 2 veterinarians and animal technicians. She studied animal nutrition. She studied the history of the United States around issues of animals. Animals spread diseases. Unfortunately, in Asia, we had bird flu at the time, and so you were very helpful to talk about that. But everything that we dealt with was related to animals, mathematics, those kinds of things. And what we also discovered, this was mostly learning. It was learning about careers and academics. But she took puppies and kittens to elementary schools to show kids how to take care of them and tell their age and things. And the kids went home and told their mothers and fathers that there were these cute puppies and kittens at the animal shelter. And lo and behold, the adoption rate at the shelter went up 20%. So her high school experience was literally saving the lives of dogs and cats. This was in Los Angeles, where they would euthanize animals about every 10 to 15 days because they just had too many. And so it was a great example for me of how to connect academic learning with experiential learning. We didn't call it service learning. I didn't know what that was at that time, but it was absolutely service learning. And so I went from that area to being a work experience coordinator, so I was involved with community, learning about how people learn careers, and so we had kids who were out doing internships. Happenstance, I became a librarian, so I started to learn about how you organize information and things of that nature, and that was kind of a fun job. And then I did a dissertation. I developed a high school for health sciences, part of my work at UCLA. And so we had kids who were right across the street from a medical center. And we had them go 3 hours a week in the 10th grade to explore careers. By the time they were seniors, they were exploring 2 careers 1.5 days a week. When I say exploring careers, they were learning their academic subjects in physiology, in chemistry, in physics. So when they went to the pulmonary functions lab, there happened to be a blood gas analyzer in the corner so they could learn pH. And they could learn some concepts. They even worked in the laundry, so they were sorting laundry. But if you read laundry journals, they're all about chemistry. How do you get vomit out of clothes? How do you get blood out? All those kinds of things. And so we were developing an academic high school. What I learned in that experience was we were the only high school in the entire United States, probably in the world, that had a $1 million electron microscope as part of our science program. Anybody here have $1 million electron microscope in your high school science? No. We had all kinds of facilities in the medical center. And it taught me that the community needs to be engaged, especially in the age of technology where things change so quickly, that schools have outdated materials, can never continue to upgrade. It's only in a business community and in the real world that you find those kinds of things. So that's another reason that I'm very passionate about why we need to connect effectively with the community. Went on, as I said, did my dissertation, became director, assistant director, and director of field studies at UCLA. So I was working with 30 departments at an institution of 35,000 students, trying to encourage community-connected learning in many, many disciplines at the undergraduate and graduate level. I then went to Minnesota, did some research projects, but I started the National Service Learning Clearinghouse, which was the first effort to try to develop a network and system to collect information about programs all over the United States, both at the elementary, secondary level and at the higher ed level. UCLA was the higher ed clearinghouse component. And so we were able to do that. We actually were collecting information internationally too. We had a lot of people who were saying, we just want to know about programs. And one of the things that we've discovered is you don't need somebody from Minnesota to come here to talk to you because you have experts right here in Hong Kong. Every community that I've been around in not only the United States but in many countries, you have people who are doing this kind of work. They may not call it service learning, but they understand what it means to connect young people with community for academic purposes. Another part of my life later on was in career and technical education, so I was also the internal evaluator for the National Center for Research on Career and Technical Education. And a lot of people in the service learning world in the United States have no idea what the Association for Career and Technical Education is, and yet that association has put out journals that are focused specifically on service learning. So when students are in a culinary arts program and they're feeding homeless people on Saturdays, they call that service learning. And we had high school culinary arts program working with a social studies teacher, and they were studying in social studies the Civil War. The culinary arts students were preparing the food that people ate during the Civil War. So literally food for thought. And so you have lots of opportunities, and we have lots of separations that have created a lot of barriers to get people together who are doing this thing that we think is service learning. So let me go on. So what are the basic goals of education? I won't read them all to you, but basically it's about learning skills of not only the academic things of reading and writing, learning the skills of how to get along in a family and prepare for productive lives. You understand that, especially universities that claim to be liberal arts institutions. It's all about how to prepare to learn in life. And so that's what we need to do in our academic programs. And how do we learn? Young children learn without a teacher, right? They learn language by listening in their families. And so they learn by watching and listening, interacting. And they also learn by having experiences and learning from those experiences. And Tim has shared with you the Kolb cycle about going from concrete experience where you reflect on that experience, try to connect to a theory, and then you test that theory in a new context. And so it's all about experiential learning. So what's service? Lots of examples. Anybody, how many people have never done a service activity in their life?
What do you mean by service? Is this volunteer? What is
Well, that's part of the notion. Volunteer, it's doing something. It usually doesn't involve any training. The assumption is that you want to do it and you're going to be helpful. It usually doesn't involve any evaluation. It assumes that you volunteer and people are happy because you're helping them. And it usually assumes that you don't need much training. You're going to work in a soup kitchen, you go and you ladle out food or something of that nature, or set up the tables. You don't need a graduate degree in table setting up. And so as I'm suggesting, you don't have much training, you can do it a short period of time, you can volunteer 1 hour a month. And it assumes anybody can volunteer. So what's service learning? I'm going to read a little bit to you from the originators of service learning. But it's different. It assumes that the volunteering is occurring. But the assumption is that the need for the volunteering comes from the community. It assumes, as the hyphen suggests, that's connected. That there's a reciprocal relationship, and I'll read a few things that hopefully will help you to better understand that. And in my work in China, one of the themes in the 1930s in China was this notion that scholars apprentice with farmers. That was the idea of how you would begin to create teams of connecting scholars with people in the community who know what their academic or what their field is. So farmers know how to do farming and all of those kinds of things, and scholars can hopefully work together. So that's a really strong notion. And it involves action and reflection. In our book on service learning, two of the people who originated the term, Bob Sigmund and Bill Ramsey, have written chapters. And it's hard to believe that service learning came out of nuclear war. That's a great thing to think about. But, actually, the nuclear lab in the United States in the South was part of the origin of the program, the Oak Ridge Lab, which was in Tennessee. And here's what is part of his chapter. He was saying, meanwhile, Orange, which is this network from the lab, was seeking ways to contribute to a push for resource and community development. With a grant from the Department of Labor, it published a report entitled Manpower for Development, suggesting ways to better train and utilize human resources based on what was learned about relating higher education with the atomic energy program. The report called for an upgrading of vocational training using the high technology of Oak Ridge. It suggested other ways to mobilize the resources of education, industry, and government in the area for development. Recommendations included internships with community service and development agencies involving students and faculty. The cooperation of the Atomic Energy Commission, University of Tennessee, and Union Carbide Corporation, which was operating the Oak Ridge lab. Orange organized a training program for unemployed and underemployed persons. It was a hybrid of apprenticeship and institutional training at a very high level. He says, for example, welding was taught with space-age specifications rather than the typical machine shop standards. Graduates were highly employable and left into high-paying jobs. So this notion, part of the people who were involved, Ramsey, was a manpower development program. So they were doing internships. And then he goes on to talk about the fact, he says, before we moved to Atlanta, where the Southern Region Education Board was, we had a meeting in my office to discuss, among other things, what to call this arrangement we were promoting between agencies and educational institutions. Sigmund was there. Bob Sigmund was one of the co-developers, and Sigmund came out of the American Friends Service Committee, so he had a Quaker orientation, so he had kind of a religious thing. He had spent 3 years in Pakistan working as a volunteer. So he had that orientation. He said, we were familiar with cooperative education, field experience programs, practice teaching, and other useful devices for linking education experience. But none seemed to fit. We considered experiential learning, action learning, and other combinations. We finally settled on service learning because it implied a value dimension that best described what we were trying to do. The hyphen in service learning was considered very important, suggesting a mutually supported balance between providing a service and thinking about it in a disciplined way. Here's a shocker. They invited Donald Everly, who was developing something called the National Service Secretariat, which was a national service program in the United States, to do their evaluation and help them come up with a term. And Don consulted a friend who was a Greek scholar and came up with the phrase diaconia paideia and used that name in his report. We, of course, asked Don to interpret it for us. He explained that the word diaconia means community with a service connotation, as in deacon, a person who serves the community. Paideia, he said, is the same root as pedagogy or teaching. Thus it meant community service as a teacher or service learner. How many of you are doing paideia, diaconia paideia? They turned it down. They said that was too complicated and fancy. So that's the word we use today, or the word service learning, could have been that. But they chose to use something that was much more formal or informal. He goes on to say, and now, 50 years later, the phrase service learning is commonly used throughout the country to describe programs linking community service and learning goals and outcomes. The phrase means somewhat different things to different people. To some, it's primarily a service program with student learning acknowledged. Others see it primarily as an educational technique using a community service setting to meet an academic requirement. I prefer to think of it as a way of thinking and of living. A life of service is whatever setting and a mind alive with questions and new learning from experience is full and satisfying. So here's the originator of the term, and he's telling you that it's a way of life. It's more than just service and learning. And guess what? It wasn't just Sigmund and Ramsey in the 1960s. Someone else was talking about service learning a long time ago. You ever hear of this guy? Confucius was talking about something I believe was very similar. And the notion of Confucianism is based on these principles, which are the 5 virtues. Do you read about these in school? Are you all familiar with this? You have to do it, okay. Okay. But in all seriousness, if you look at these principles in terms of empathy and benevolence, acting respectfully, the notion of reciprocity, but the most important part that I talk about is the 5th one, about learning and knowledge. It becomes part of life, just as Ramsey told us this is a way of life. For Confucius, it's a way of life. But we must use knowledge to gain wisdom during your life to make change. I'm going to talk about it a little later, but I suggest that what we really need to do is to teach for wisdom, not knowledge. The problem that we face, and one of the reasons we titled our book, Where's the Wisdom in Service Learning, is that knowledge is something that you can teach in a discipline in a classroom. Wisdom isn't something that you can do unless you have experience. Wisdom also involves analytical and critical thinking, and it also involves creative thinking. And so we think that wisdom is a pretty important concept, and we'll talk about it a little bit. Okay. And so it's been developing in Asia, and you're familiar with SLAN, the Service Learning Asia Network, and Yangnan has been very much involved in that, and Hong Kong has. But it's spreading, and in many ways is exactly what happened in the United States in the 1960s and 70s, where universities were combining, getting together and collaborating, just as you're doing here. So history is repeating itself. I use this slide simply to call your attention to the fact that we have a problem in education trying to figure out what we call this work that people are doing. And the experiential learning world has suggested that the best term to use is project. And there's a whole initiative in the United States on project-based learning. And what we find is that when people have projects imply long-term duration, intensity, focus. And so we like to use the word project-based learning because it provides the context for all of the work that we're going to do. Lots of studies about service learning in the United States, and the National Youth Leadership Council, working more at the K-12 level, had come up with principles of good practice. And again, you can read them all, but intensity and duration, link to curriculum, etc. These are the elements that go into high-quality programming. And so if you're not doing all of these, or most of them, then we would suggest that you're probably not doing the highest quality service learning that you would like to do. At the clearinghouse, we had people contributing and telling us that they were doing service learning, and we would suggest that about 75% of the people who submitted programs were not doing service learning. They were doing community service. There might be a little bit of learning, but many of them didn't require students to do any reading, didn't require them to do any writing. And so they were doing community service and doing it very well, but it wasn't what a lot of people considered to be high-quality service learning. And to call your attention to some of the key elements, intensity and duration matter. So if you're trying to learn how to play golf, I can give you a 20-minute introduction and then finish in 20 minutes and say, well, okay, now go out and play golf. And you'll say, it might take me a little longer, 200 years or something. But in all seriousness, you have to practice, you have to get involved in things. So habits are important and they take time. Important part is connecting to curriculum. So I would suggest, I have another slide later on, that if you call yourself an academy, an institution of higher education, or a high school or a middle school, then you have some kind of curriculum. You're supposed to be teaching about something. And so this has been, in many ways, the biggest downfall for service learning, is finding ways to connect to curriculum. So you can send people out and have them work at a shelter and provide food, and they're doing nice things and the people are happy. But when you say, well, what are you learning? They say, well, we're learning how to give out food, and you're trying to look in your curriculum and say, do you have a course that you give academic credit at Lingnan University on how to ladle food? Probably not. And so that's been the challenge. How do we make that kind of connection? It involves partnerships. And as Tim has suggested over the last few days, partnerships take time to develop. In fact, most universities have very limited partnerships, and the partnerships are for the purpose of the university, not for the community. And communities know that. And so a lot of the work that I've done over the years with lots of universities suggests that it takes time. And you need to embrace community people to be part of your team. And so we've seen lots of good examples where there are actually faculty who are co-teaching courses on a particular subject, and they have a community member as one of their co-facilitators to bring credibility to the work that they do. And as your CSP focus for this whole week is all about, is getting the business community and the government and a lot of these formal organizations to be partners in your work. And that means that you, again, have to build relationships. You have to engage them. And we'll talk later about evaluation and program development, so that hopefully you can find some common area where they're willing to provide you with funding, provide you with resources that you wouldn't be able to provide on your own. We know about the community shared values in terms of the business community that would like to see the kind of innovation and entrepreneurship connected to this movement that we call service learning. But for me, in my old age, I'm finding that progress monitoring is probably one of the most important elements, because it suggests that you have to do continuous assessment and evaluation. A lot of the work that I do both quantitative and qualitative work, but I tend to fall on the qualitative side because continuous evaluation suggests that 6 weeks into a program, you might find that there's some real problems, and you can change them. If you're doing more traditional kinds of evaluation, where you do pre and post or things like that, you find out that your program didn't work at the end of the program. Well, that's great, but it didn't help in terms of improving it while it was happening. And so continuous program monitoring is very critical. How many of you are familiar with the UN goals? So the United Nations has come up with 17 global goals that we all need to address. We don't have to solve all of them today in 20 minutes. We can take an hour. But in all seriousness, they outline the most critical issues that the world is facing. And hopefully you'll be able to incorporate some of those things into the programs that you're working on, especially as we talk about global citizenship and the fact that we need international programs to work together. So there are lots of, if you look at the UN things, there are lots of issues. Poverty, health, and et cetera. You don't have to solve them all. The goal is to try to see if you can focus on one and maybe have one or two others kind of blend into it. But one of the biggest issues that we have sometimes is we try to do too much and we end up doing nothing. And so you need to get focused. And the focusing can be, hopefully again, from the community. We'll talk about that. But there are 3 pillars of service learning. We have Tim and Dwight Giles and I wrote a chapter in here kind of going through the history from the 1970s to the current time. And the history of service learning in the last several centuries is about the commons. It used to be that people came together in a community where they would have their business interactions, where they would sell food, they would come together and they would talk about building their houses. I can't imagine why in Hong Kong in the 17th century there weren't 30-story residences, but I guess it was partly because they built them themselves, and they didn't have a lot of tall people. But in all seriousness, community was very operational centuries ago. And there's a lot of writing in sociology and other fields today that's concerned about the loss of community. You may have heard of a book in the United States called Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam. And he talks about the 19th century where lots of organizations came together, YMCA and other things in the United States. And there were bowling leagues where people would bowl together. And now, in the 21st century, people bowl by themselves. They don't belong to leagues. A lot of the public organizations don't exist anymore. People don't join things. And now with the internet, we're very concerned about what's happening to young people, especially in terms of communication and interaction. And yet there's another whole group of people now who are saying the internet now builds community in a different way. So we saw in the United States, and unfortunately with the shooting in the school in Florida, that within a period of a few days, those kids were able to mobilize young people all over the country and raise money in ways that were unheard of before this decade. So the notion of the commons, the communities that you work with, you want to start looking at what are the common things that bring people together. How do people connect? The other issue is civil society. And people say, what is civil society? And we try to argue that civil society kind of started several centuries ago. But when I would ask, how did you get here today? You might respond by saying, well, I took the metro. And we would say, well, how's that a demonstration of civil society? Well, civil society means that people have come together and jobs have become divided. Whereas few people had few jobs hundreds of years ago, now people have specialized jobs. So somebody laid the track for that metro. Somebody else designed the engine for that metro. Somebody else designed the electricity that's used. And so we're all interdependent on people and the various jobs that they perform in our society. And so part of our goal in a civil society is figuring out how to blend those. And our issue of social justice, for example, is why do some people, like in the United States, a good football player make $80 million and somebody who drives a snowplow in Minnesota, that when we have heavy snowstorms, people couldn't even get around if they weren't doing their job. Why is that person not worth $80 million? And so in civil society, we start to talk about how do we allocate resources related to the kind of work that people do. And of course, the last one and the critical one is experiential learning. And that is that we believe that you must have experience in order to learn. So those are the three pillars. So what's the role of evaluation? As I was suggesting, that in my old age, I'm coming to believe it's probably the most important. It's because in some respects, you can't say you're doing service unless you have a way of showing that the people who are receiving the service describe it as service. You don't have a way of showing that those providing the service believe that they're serving. And Tim gave that wonderful example about the program in South Africa of the women. Does everybody here have Tim's program? So when the women had the well built and they were walking an hour each way to get water, they destroyed the well because they realized that that was their only social interaction. And so if you don't have input, one of the things we would hope in that situation for a better outcome than destroying the well was that if we had had constant monitoring and talking with those women, they would have realized that they had lost this social interaction and being able to come up with something else besides destroying the well. So maybe they could have had an educational program for young women, or they could have had, playing some kind of card game and all of those kinds of things. So a lot of times when we think we're doing service, it needs to be perceived as service. I have the example of middle school kids who are tutoring third graders. The middle school kids were writing in their journals and they were getting credit in their English class, and the third graders were improving in their reading, and we had test scores to show that they were improving in their reading. And then when we followed up with some interviews with some of the third graders, and we said, how do you like the program? And there was this one young man who said, I hate it. He said, because when the middle school kid comes, he pulls me out and I sit outside and we go over my reading, and all my friends know I'm stupid. And I'm a dumb reader, and I can't wait for it to be over so I can go back. So we were able to change that program so that the kids had reading groups that involved good readers and poor readers, and they didn't start pulling them out. So that student didn't perceive what was happening to him as service. So that's why it's an important element to make sure that the people you're working with tell you that what they are receiving is perceived as service. And so why is it critical? As I suggest, evaluation is included in every part of service learning. You have to determine community needs. That's an evaluation process. You have to make sure that the service is performed and perceived as service, that you have demonstrations of learning. Do the community people learn? Do your students learn? So those are all evaluative activities. And again, if you believe that service learning has a value dimension, as Bill Ramsey suggested, and you're about some kind of social change, then you need to have evidence that change has occurred. Because you can do a lot of things, and one of the questions we would ask is, well, the world is in pretty lousy shape in a lot of areas, and people have been serving them for a long time. How come it hasn't worked? So our goal is to say, if we're doing effective service learning, we should be able to show that somehow the community has changed for the better. So I'll give you a couple of quick examples. How am I doing on time? Okay. One of the things that we learned, again, in higher education and using the principles of intensity and duration, that we needed to do something to be able to get our students into the community for more intense periods of time. And one thing that doesn't happen very often in higher ed is called team teaching. So we're all in disciplines and we don't work together. So we developed what are called immersion quarters. And lots of universities are beginning to use immersion quarters. And we were able to combine sociology class, an introduction to anthropology and ethnography, and an English composition class. And in mentioning these things, I would really encourage you to think about what is the academic content of the courses that you teach in your university, and where do those things occur in the community? The biggest problem that we face is that university faculty don't live in the community, and they don't know what the applications are, and the people in the community have no idea what the academic content is that is related to the work that they do or the needs that they have. And so we created this program so that we would have students in the community 10 to 15 hours a week. Community agencies treated our students very differently when they had them there, like an employee, as opposed to a volunteer who was there just for a few hours. And half the time was for service, so whatever the community agency wanted the student to do, that was part of their work. Half their time, and this was an agreement with the agency, was that they had academic things that they had to pursue in their study of ethnography. So they had to know, how was the organization put together? What was its history? What was its goal? What was the purpose? How was it measuring its success? And so they had to do an entire study of the organization itself. And of course, the writing faculty member had the students writing papers and journals, and so they were all graded in terms of the academic content for the writing class. The students ended up doing 35 to 50-page papers on their experience, and it was graded by all three faculty. And so the Soc faculty, just in that example, was looking at some of the concepts that they covered in a Soc 1 course: family, communities, socioeconomic status, the role of government, NGOs, and all those kinds of things. And also the notion of social capital. What were the networks that were being created in the organization, the networks with the community, the networks with all of the people who were involved? And so we were expecting students to come out of this program with the same kind of academic content knowledge that they would have if they had a traditional Soc 1 class, but they were learning it in the context of a community experience. And so that's what we were trying to do by extending the time. And goodness gracious, what happened? The organization said it was very different to have somebody there for 15 hours a week than a volunteer. They could really help with the organization in terms of implementing activities and the kinds of things that the people could get involved with. They started to develop, as part of the ethnography, assessment of their own program. What are we trying to do, and how do we know if we're being very effective? They learned research skills, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the students, when they wrote their papers, they actually were pretty academic papers. And the students were starting to present at undergraduate research forums and conferences around the country. They were actually presenting with faculty members at some national and international conferences about the research that they were doing. So that the notion that faculty had not considered before is undergraduates can actually do legitimate research. And in fact, as people who believe in learning, in academic learning, we rely on others who have done research and studies and things of that nature. So we're just trying to engage young people in this process. But the best part for the faculty is they found that there were no books on how to turn field notes into ethnographies, and so they had an academic publication and actually wrote a book. So I don't know what your institutions are like, but usually if you're going for tenure and promotion, writing a book is helpful, presenting at conferences is helpful. And so students and faculty were beginning to work together to produce things. And then there was a follow-up course that we had in technical writing. And we found that a lot of small nonprofit organizations, NGOs, didn't have anybody to write proposals, grant proposals. And so our students were learning how to write grant proposals. So they took the knowledge of the organization and they spent more time with the organization. They also worked with foundations. And they ended up producing boilerplate proposals for the organization to submit to funders. And what it helped, again, is to understand what the goals of the organization were, how they measured their successes, the needs that they had, all of those kinds of things. And lo and behold, first semester we did it, $30,000 was awarded to these four organizations to improve their operations and services. So it's, again, a way of thinking. Service learning sometimes serves everybody else. How do we serve ourselves? How do we serve the organizations in helping them to generate more funds? This was one way of doing it, again, through an academic course. At the University of Minnesota, we developed an evaluation course on evaluating community programs. And we actually had a little bit of funding from the state, but we did a 5-year study of AmeriCorps. AmeriCorps is a national service program in the United States. Students, AmeriCorps members receive a stipend to volunteer with a community organization. And so we started to look at how do you teach participatory empowerment evaluation through actually being involved in the evaluation process. And so our students worked with the community agencies, they interviewed the AmeriCorps members, they interviewed the agencies to find out what the members were supposed to be doing. They actually assessed the impact, the practice. So as I said at the bottom, they were developing surveys or doing focus groups. They were doing all the things that we would normally teach in an evaluation course in the context of the work with the AmeriCorps program. But again, in true service learning spirit, they were actively engaged with the community, which was something that didn't happen in a lot of the AmeriCorps programs. Corps members were serving the community agency, but there wasn't the kind of active dialogue that we would hope in high-quality service learning. And so they helped to develop the assessment instruments, the surveys, asked some of the questions, and we did the study for a period of 5 years. As I suggest, I have a little background in economics, and I had a couple of econ students, and we actually did a cost-benefit study. And one of the things that I think the service learning world has missed is the opportunity to show policymakers and legislators that by engaging students in community work, there's an economic return that's far superior to having students just sitting in classrooms and not having any interaction with the community. And the last one, we had one student who got involved with a AmeriCorps member who had muscular dystrophy. And she was having a problem because she was being paid a disability payment from the government. but her AmeriCorps stipend was counting against her disability payments, so she was actually losing income. And in this 40-page report following her work, she needed to rest in the afternoons and things like that. They were able to change national policy to begin to realize that nobody had ever thought about the fact that an AmeriCorps stipend could be harmful to somebody who had a disability. So we had a lot of data and information about the impact of the Corps members on their communities. Again, doing good service learning, and we had community input in trying to articulate what the goals were and what they expected the Corps members to do. And it helped the Corps members and the community agencies to have dialogue so that they all knew what they were supposed to be about. One of the surprising things from surveys over the 5 years was that the greatest impact was jobs. AmeriCorps members, people who volunteer, are actually doing jobs. And when they reported what they learned most, it was something about jobs. And in fact, we had data as we did follow-up to show that when they went out compared to their peers, they got better paying jobs and jobs that actually had benefits, healthcare and those kinds of things, where a lot of their colleagues who weren't involved in the AmeriCorps program had jobs, but they didn't have that kind of support. So again, those were the kinds of things that we were able to show that gave the legislators and the policy people a lot of ammunition to say that this AmeriCorps program was really doing what everybody hoped it would do and having benefits that in some respects we didn't even anticipate. So the goal was to show that the university can deliver service through evaluation. And in fact, most organizations want evaluation, they just don't have the resources to do it. So the more we can get connected around evaluation, the better off we are. The interesting thing, too, for research on youth-led evaluation, and I guess you all have a copy of a book, a little book that we did a few years ago. It was written more for younger people, middle and high school kids, but it's been used in colleges and community agencies, just about how to have youth lead evaluations. So it's about participatory evaluation. And it's been translated into Chinese, and so you have a copy of that. They suppose they were going to send us a copy, but from China. But I guess in China they don't know where Hong Kong is anymore. So anyhow, hopefully they'll get here eventually. But the research on youth-led evaluation, a lot of the work that I've done, some of the work that I've done, is with very young people. So we did a big study in San Diego, California, on character education, respect, responsibility, and caring in an elementary school. And the fifth graders did the study, 10-year-olds. And they looked with college students, helping them who were experienced in quantitative study. They looked at data that they had for the first 10 weeks and the last 10 weeks of their program. They developed the rubrics around what respect, responsibility, and caring looked like. It was actually done bilingually. They had it in English and Spanish. And long story short, they had statistical data to show that they improved their caring behavior in their elementary school. So it's a great way for 10-year-olds to learn math. They learned a lot of math if they learned statistics. And we assume that if 10-year-olds can do that kind of work, then your undergraduates and graduates can too. But again, if they have a meaningful project, then they have a focus. And that's really what most people want. They want to be grounded. What am I supposed to do? What am I looking at? In fact, what we found was that the 10-year-olds were saying that some of the teachers weren't collecting the data very effectively. So you have confidentiality issues. You don't want to have them tell a principal that some of the teachers weren't doing what they were supposed to do. But they talked about the importance of the feedback and the discussion of the improvement. And the elementary kids said when our program ended in the second year, they wanted to continue it, so they developed some tubes in their lunchroom, and they would actually tell the students what the scores were for the previous week. So the kids were able to get feedback on their respect, responsibility, and caring behavior by going to the lunchroom and seeing kind of a graphic representation. So we thought that was pretty creative, but that's the other part of doing this kind of youth-led evaluation, is the more you can make it continuous and relevant to their lives, the more they can use it in positive ways. It transforms the kids because they now think of themselves as somebody who is more than just a student who's 10 years old. They have data. They can interact with adults in ways that they couldn't before. They say, we want to change this program, and here's our information that suggests the reasons why we should do it. It involved them in meaningful ways in their programs, and it gave them power. Power to try to make change by using data and information. And so that's one of the goals that we have, hopefully in the service learning world, is to empower our students so that they have the tools that are necessary in order to make community change. So the more that you can engage your students in the evaluation process, the more we believe you can have the kind of information that will influence policymakers and NGOs and others that certain changes need to happen. Not too many of you are asleep yet, so I appreciate that. I wanted to do a little interactive thing so that we could ground it in experience. You may not be aware, but there is a little bit of poverty in Hong Kong. And so I have a couple of reports, and this is just a basic summary, but we're talking about almost 20% of the population in Hong Kong is considered to be poor. And the Shui poor is the poorest. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a couple of profiles and then ask you to get in some groups and see if you could come up with a service learning program that's going to address the situation. So let me ask, how do I get into my case study? Yeah. Okay. No, just that picture that you had. Okay, here we are. So you need to take some real quick notes. Here we have it in Chinese and English. Here's a woman, Mrs. Kwam. She talks about some issues that she has. Lives on her pension, doesn't have any savings to renovate her old flat. She doesn't have money to replace her broken washing machine and LPG stove. Okay, so make a mental note of that. What are the issues that she's dealing with? Do we have it in Chinese? Okay. Here we have. This is all Chinese, right?
About the science, actually, it's just talking about the poor elderly people. They have very little or no income, and they don't have enough to eat, and
Okay, well,
they have broken furniture or things like that. Cooking
Okay.
utensils.
Right. Okay, well, let's look at the second story that we have. So we're talking to the community member, and this one says that she only can have vegetables and small fish, and pork for soup, but she would choose to separate that small piece of pork for a few meals. You go on, she'd pick vegetables discarded by stalls. Sometimes I'd use $1 to buy some stale vegetables, although her washing machine has been out of order for 10 years. She's no money to replace it. Her LPG stove is broken down too, and she has no savings to buy a new one. Okay, so we have two families, right? Two elderly families. What I'm going to ask you to do is, based on the information that you've heard, to have you think about starting a service learning initiative to serve these families. What would you do? What would be your goals? What would the program look like? And how would you assess it? Okay, we'll take about 15 minutes. Yeah, in the groups right where you're at. It's okay to talk to each other.
So the service learning is for that community or that person alone?
Those two people are representing people in their community. So you're going to develop a program that addresses the needs that they've identified. We're going to be assuming that they're all people.
It looks like it's the same the same algorithm.
The first thing, obviously, is to identify the issue that you're going to address. What's the project going to be about? Who's going to be involved?
Clearly, she needs to learn a lot more science, so I can Thank you.
They just up and down, and so they always each other. You're from Taiwan, which university?
So we have one design software project to serve to some more community resources that you can.
Seems very similar to what Crossroads Foundation is trying to do. They do it at a massive scale. They collect discarded things and then pass them to people, secondhand things. And so the problem is this woman doesn't know who to talk to at Crossroads to find out, right? So lots of people are changing their washing machines while they still function. Many people are upgrading their cookers while they're still functional. No one talks, right? And I know I went with one of the service learning things when we went to John Iton, I think, where they were taking sort of these discarded vegetables. And so again, there's people out there doing these things. The poor woman sitting in her flat has no idea. So these the connections.
Specific needs.
What do you think are the issues?
We've been talking about connecting the community resources. There's some available somewhere, but not available.
We're looking at the elderly woman. And so she has basically sort of basic human needs related to food, related to household utensils, things that let her family go. Recognizing that there are secondhand products around town that would benefit from the school. There are people in town who actually do that. She just doesn't know. There's no making the connection. Yeah, wait. Let's make that a product. There are people who are already, NGOs that are already doing a very good job gathering these things, providing them to they just don't know she's a person in need. She's not the person.
But they both have the same needs and solutions. Washing machines and stoves. Trying to figure out how to get to the washing machine. One of the issues that you're thinking about.
Why don't you write down a brilliant plan? Don't use the word brilliant.
That's a brilliant color. That's all we can have it to buy that brilliant brand.
You want me to show them to you again?
So the problem is, so I think a place like Crossroads Foundation is doing a problem job doing this in some
Supposed to be
level.
doing needs
The
assessment.
markets
What do they need?
doing a good job spreading out food. That service exists. How do we make this service learning? So where's the learning? What is it? Students are learning in something
Once you
like
get
this.
on your focus on it, say, what the program begins with, what would you do? If we have a need for food, what would you do in order to meet that?
We mentioned before that ask the student to write a story the situation and
So another project that you're suggesting is making other people aware of their situation. Students, as you say, writing their so if you have to do that, what do those students do with their story? How are you going to, from the assessment perspective, how are you going to achieve some kind of change in their lives? We're just starting. This is just a thinking exercise.
So what would be a class? What kind of class? Sociology, political science, cultural, I don't know.
因為有啲書係政治，就係好似冷氣、藥食，但係有啲書
I thought you were starting to write in Chinese. Make sure that you drew the characters correctly.
Maybe there's some other reason behind, but we need to find it out. Maybe heard about what she was told that one day, but was some reason we don't know why that she was being judged.
Are there courses taught like about elderly issues that would be a course that generically could go after something like age? Yes, it's about right. So people would need skill, I mean, there are certain
可以熟習少少。
different skill set required to,
即係
I'm
大
sure,
人咧可以
interview
幫
the elderly than it is to approach
但
children.
係如果就係
And
知
so you need to learn
可
something
能
about that.
只係揾一兩個，介紹一兩個咁樣叫上場或者嘅人可以幫。咁但係當然之後我哋可以加入嘅
Right.
問題。
See, that was my dream before when I was still at Texas Tech was to generate one. I'd never heard it called this immersion quarter. I worked on that so hard, and getting buy-in to that was really. And as I sat there, I go, we don't have that sort of capstone experience at Lingon, and this would be a perfect place to do it. I think that aging is the perfect. Is the perfect place to do. So yeah, we'll have our whole term figured out in about 5 more minutes.
Okay, yeah, let's take 5 more minutes and then we'll talk.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. So we have the expertise and the connections in place to put one of these immersive full quarter. I mean, I think that's really powerful because what happens is my students go to Gaia school and it's fun, right? No, it's great. And they have an experience, but then they have to run because they need to go to whatever their next class is. So if we're having them for one term, so we send them to internships, we send them off, but to actually have them here, control what they do in a useful way, that's really powerful, I think. Thinking about, this is what, and I think OSL on some level has to do this. In terms of pushing for this notion of really having multiple, these problems are multidisciplinary, so they're not going to be solved by one professor and their class. But Professor X, Y, and Z together can bring this unique perspective. And that would be those are the sorts of things that you show on the website, you show on the videos. As a liberal arts college, we have the ability to do small fact, we have small.
Team-based learning experience, multiple disciplines. Remember this guy through the whole research process,
Which is really an exciting.
this assessment.
No, it does, right? It needs someone who's the champion, and it needs someone who.
其實喺實際嘅幫助，即係你例如話，總之有100人嘅幫，
Yeah, so that's right. It would take.
其實
No, exactly. But
即係幫緊
it would take to write 3 or 4 professor team members.
1 minute and then we'll
Get it. And I think I don't know. I mean, I know there's lots of things going on at Lincoln that are stifling creativity, teaching primarily to push for research. But I think that is looking for interesting things. So if you said you were going to do one of these kinds of things, and here's how it's going to work, his first answer is at Texas Tech, the first answer is we don't do things this way. And I go, well, and that was where conversation stopped. And then after a while, you say, I'm not going to bang my head against the wall. But we may be able to try some of these.
let's pause.
So they can
And
bring it together.
remember, this is just an exercise to begin the thinking process. You don't have to have your finished product until June 2077.
Our pages are published, so.
So let's just get a flavor. What did your group talk about? What is the issue that you're going to address, and what are you starting to think about in terms of how to address it?
So our service learning course will be named as Holistic Healthy Lifestyle. So we want to address about the food issue by teaching students some about how we can assess an individual as a healthy status, physically and mentally. And we will let the students, they can do the home visit with the elderly, and so they can know about their problems, and they can try to line up with some food banks so that they can have some food from like the NGO in their community. And at the same time, we think if we invite them to go out to the food banks and collect the food, we can also provide a chance for them to engage with other elderly so that we can facilitate their mental health and they can have some support from each other. And for the home visit, we also have the students, they can learn how to talk with elderly's problems, and also they can learn how to assess their food nutrition, about their health status, and they can give like tailor-made advice to them. So that's.
So you're dealing with the food issue, and we're talking about connecting with food banks, and we can provide them with better food, kind of the sociology of how to communicate with elders. And these are hidden elders, people who are isolated, and also trying to work with their social interactions. We're trying to do lots of different things. Okay, we'll get to the point about evaluation a little bit later. How about this one?
Hello, everyone. I'm a student from Lingnan, and thank you very much. Yeah, our project is called Ling Connect. Yeah, so actually we are going to cooperate with different local NGOs because we know that there are many NGOs dealing with those problems, no matter it's about the food problem for the elderly and the poor or the equipment in their home. So maybe we are deciding to cooperate with the food NGO in Hong Kong, and they are collecting the leftover in the wet market, so they can collect their food and then cook by the volunteer and distribute in different lunch boxes, and then the elderly may go to their center and pick up their food. And also maybe we should clean up their home for their student volunteer, because maybe their elderly in their home, they are not able to move around, so we can help them with hygiene environment for them to live. And also we know that some their power supplier in Hong Kong, they need to deal with their CSR, and then maybe we can invite them to go to the elderly home and then repair the equipment or the furniture with them, like the washing machine. And last but not least, we can cooperate with the Chu Kwon Pen and the Crossroad in Hong Kong. They are collecting the old furniture for different people. Like when your home need to change the furniture, but the old one is not really old, then you can donate them to the center, and they will distribute to the elderly. And the Crossroad is because they have some old furniture, then the refugees will help us to repair their furniture, so they can have a cultural exchange. And we want to have a local community forum for the government and the community partner to go and come together and listen what the elderly really need. And what we want to mention is the empowerment of the elderly. So maybe we cannot just give them anything they want. Maybe we can invite them to help us for different parts, like maybe they have some skills can teach the student, then they can help us to teach the student, and then they can get back what they need. So it's better for them to receive different things. Yeah, thank you.
Actually, we didn't have anything written down. We just didn't have enough time to write down and just talk about. We try to maybe for some language students, we can ask them to write some articles to get the attention and awareness of how worse it is for the poor people, the elderly people, so that the society can know how worse it is. And I think for the service learning, some kind of service learning is indirect, helping the needy people. So we just ask some language students to write the story, and at the time we can also train them how to talk to the needy people, like the interview skills, and what else we can do. And okay.
Maybe I can add on some points. The point that we would like to write the articles because we want to raise the attention, especially for the business sector, because mostly we often left out this sector. We want that more organizations, apart from the NGO or other government organization, the business sector, they can set up some resources for providing food to the elderly. So this is one of the purpose that we would like to write some articles that or some other promotional activities that could raise draw the attention from the business sector.
Actually, our group didn't write any things, but we got those points from other groups. So we include food, also those second-hand electronic applicants, and also some ideas of writing. So I would like to add one point is the community need assessment. That we think is the most important, that we can send students to the district, to the elderly home, to talk with them, to identify what their real needs, what they really need our help. So we would like to add this, and then from the community assessment, then we developed, maybe we get the data, and then we can talk to other different departments, like Chinese departments, sociology departments. So add those elements for other groups, same, yeah, to further develop some programs for the students, or the students can initiate their own program to us. Thank you.
How do I get back to you? I'm going to give you my response, but I first want to compliment you on your discussion, because what you have unearthed is the complexity of trying to do service learning. You came up with issues, the food issue. You came up with issues of the appliance repair and power generation, of getting good nutrition to them. You even talked about creating a social environment so that people who are isolated could begin to have some kind of network. And I did hear in some of your groups, you were thinking about or asking questions, what would be the academic courses that would go along with this stuff? And So that's something that you might want to think about. I was just, in the last group you were talking, I was thinking, well, that's journalism. You could have people doing journalism, create a newsletter or something like that, writing those kind of articles. Of course, it relates to issues of doing research, because you might want to write about somebody and they don't want you to use their name, or they don't want you to violate their confidentiality and say, oh, hey, I'm a real important person. But you've raised the kinds of issues that hopefully your students and you will be raising as you start to think about how you address issues. You address one, you are all very complicated and wanted to deal with multiple things. And so that's great. The more that you can talk to the people and get them involved, because I'll use a point that none of the things that we read about may be the issues that they would really be concerned with. So let me go through just a few things in terms of us starting to use participatory empowerment evaluation approaches. And you were doing the first part of that, and that was the participatory piece about talking to them. Trying to get them to talk about setting up their own goals, doing interviews or focus groups. A lot of times with seniors, they don't want to fill out surveys, they like to just talk. And sometimes, from the empowerment perspective, you shouldn't be the person talking. You find the person in that community who is a trusted member, maybe a family member or a social worker or somebody who's been there, and they can begin to do that kind of work for you. And then they can introduce you, and once you get introduced as a friend of a trusted person, it helps to accelerate the relationships. And then you connect. You've talked about connecting with community members and organizations, businesses. You talked about doing a forum with government. That was great. You talked about NGOs and finding people who could help them to address some of their issues, like with the appliances. Set goals, roles, and anticipated activities. So obviously you didn't have enough time to do that, but that's something that you want to do in terms of saying, do you take 2 weeks to try to interview maybe 50 people, and based on those 50 people, then you begin to develop some kind of a program. But it does reinforce the notion that this takes time. You can't just start with a program, and I'm going to show you a bad example in some respects, to say if you just have some basic information, you say, oh, poor people need money and food. And that's not the case. We were doing work with homeless people in Los Angeles as an example, and homeless people, we would think, need housing, shelter, food. And when we talked to the homeless people, they said, you know, we've been homeless for years. We know how to get by. What we want is people to acknowledge our existence when they walk down the street. Look at us like we're a human being. That's what we miss. And so it's like, oh, our assumptions about what homeless people needed was not what the homeless people said. And so that's the other issue that you might want to make sure that you address, is to engage them so that when you do your evaluation, that they can say, yeah, I feel, connected. We started to talk to people about acknowledging the homeless and what the homeless could do. So, and you talked about some of these things in terms of getting the teams of elders to begin to be your advisory group. The goals, you talked about that. I'm going to give you an example about focusing on the appliances. To develop a program to provide appliance repair to fix all the machines. And you talked about how you could get businesses maybe to do it. Maybe there are appliance sales businesses in that community that might be willing to provide. The other piece in terms of our teacher educator, here she is, how do you connect with programs that are training people to do appliance repair? How are they certified in Hong Kong? I don't know. In the United States, we have high school programs, we have community college programs that train people how to repair appliances. So you might want to connect with those programs so that they could be doing their field work in the homes of the elderly. So as I said, part of the academic connection. So how do you involve some Lingnan students from sociology, political science, evaluation studies, sociology, studying social capital? What are the networks? Why are there isolated seniors? what's happened to their network? How come they don't have people to connect? You talked about startup businesses, engaging students again in the empowerment evaluation, and sharing results. We've already talked about that. Getting government people involved, anybody who has the policy and the position in Hong Kong to make a difference in the lives of these individuals. Those are the people who want to bring to the table. I'm really corny, so I came up with this idea about calling it an appliance of science. And I was focusing on the issue that both of these women talked about, the fact that they had problems with appliances. So I was going to create a course that deals with applications of physics and chemistry, math, engineering. You can read the rest of it in terms of appliances. Can anybody here explain the physics of how a washing machine gets rid of the water? So what we're saying is you can begin to take a context like the washing machine and build all of this work in terms of physics, in terms of laundry. We were talking with another group yesterday. You know how laundry detergent works. Why do you have to add laundry detergent? Shouldn't the water just clean the clothes? So what's in laundry detergent? Those are all chemistry and chemical activities. So you can begin to teach chemistry. You can teach the psychology. How do you pick an appliance? Do you pick it on size, on color? All of those kinds of things. And so you could work maybe with appliance companies to ask them how could they sell more appliances to older people, or what are the older people looking for? And then talking about appliances in our daily lives, what's the difference between a home that's fairly well-to-do and a home that is poor? Do they have different kinds of appliances? So we talked about washing machines and stoves, but do people have dishwashers? Do they have all kinds of other appliances in their home to do things? We call an ironing appliance. But anyhow, any kind of electrical or energy-driven device. So part of it would be trying to address the issue, which is where we're going to kind of end up on. How do you make the academic connections? A lot of times in liberal arts institution teaching sociology and ethnography and all of those kinds of things, the social sciences are easier to do. How do you teach the sciences in the context of the work that you're doing in the community? So I was just trying to give you an example about how you can begin to focus on equipment or anything that will begin to allow applications of math and mechanical engineering and chemistry and physics and all of those kinds of things. Okay? And you talked about the fact that you need to get the people involved in order to make sure that they feel that their needs were met. So if we're wanting to repair appliances, then we're going to need to have feedback where these people can tell you that they can now use their washing machine. And they feel much better about that. Let me just go down. In terms of the rubrics, in terms of evaluation, rubrics are kind of the categories that you begin to measure things. And so if you were repairing a washing machine, as an example, you might have a rubric that my washing machine works 20% of the time, works 75% of the time, works all the time. And so that the person who's in the home could tell you that the repair person came in, fixed the washing machine, and it works most of the time. It doesn't work all the time. So you have that kind of feedback mechanism to begin to say, how effective has your solution been? Going down, servants, college students learn about social issues. So is there the generic issue of poverty? All of you are kind of dealing with that issue in terms of food, availability of food. We talked about cleanliness. We talked about a lot of those kinds of issues. Those, again, are typical constructs in sociology, in psychology, in urban planning classes, and lots of different ones. So part of your goal is to find out where in your institution are there courses for which the kind of issues that you're addressing are natural content. And so when you talked about if we could create immersion programs, could you connect 2 classes or 3 classes so that the students would have the time to be able to go out and to start to do that kind of work? Again, were the other needs stated by the residents that weren't related to poverty. As I mentioned, the thing about the homeless. Some of the work that we did with elderly in Hong Kong a few years ago was when we talked to them about their needs, we thought that there were needs about money and all the things that you talked about. And what they were saying is, no, we really want to be connected to our grandchildren. That's what we miss the most in our lives. But many of them were reluctant to use Skype or some of the electronic things. So there was some kind of discussion and negotiation in terms of the fact, well, we can maybe get your grandkids here, or do your grandkids live in Hong Kong, or do they live someplace else? Because that's an issue, again, for seniors all over the world. So I can connect with my grandson through Skype, and I get to talk to him, and I can do those kinds of things. But I also can go visit once in a while. So those are the kinds of things that you may find that what we think are the obvious issues are not the obvious issues. And it's only when you start talking to people and you have a relationship with them that they begin to tell you what the real problems are. You've already talked about how you engage NGOs and how you begin. A lot of service learning programs don't think about how to involve business people or how to develop an entrepreneurial spirit where you might actually train people in that community to be appliance repair people and start a little company. So maybe you get the NGO to support it, or you get government to support it a little bit, and then they can actually develop a company. Or you could actually get seniors or their families to contribute maybe $5 a month, not very much, but it would be seed funding so that they would work like an insurance company. And so when somebody had a need for their washing machine repair, there would be a pot of money that they could use in order to pay for that kind of thing. That you would connect with your business people and your business forces. And then the issue again that I've tried to raise repeatedly is the academic connection. And so we talked about how do you connect economics, business, sociology, all of these kinds of academic subjects with the needs and the issues in the community. Because if we do that, then we don't have to do service learning as something that's outside the curriculum or outside the university, but as an integral part. One of the common ones that we've used a lot is geography. We talked about mapping. So we could map out those communities and find out where are the NGOs, where are the safe places, where are the places where people can communicate and congregate. So when you're going to bring your people out of their houses someplace, is there a safe place to go? Because sometimes, again, as outsiders, we have this great idea, we'll bring people together, but we put them in a place that they don't want to go. And I've worked with some inner cities in the United States, and there were places that were not safe. I couldn't get kids to go there on a bus because the bus was unsafe. And so, again, you need to involve people, but there are safe places. And they have to work with religious leaders, and they have to work with social workers, you have to work with other kinds of people. But you can map out communities. And then you begin to share the maps as you are using a great idea of your journalists to say, how do you get the information out to people? So maybe you create a local newsletter that fit into their housing unit. And share information about, are you having a problem with your washing machine? Here's the number to call, here's the person to connect. And then thinking about recreation. A lot of the seniors would benefit if they had some kind of a recreational program. A lot of the seniors we work with were looking for some way to get a little bit of exercise. Some of them having physical disabilities, and exercise was hard, so we actually had some students who were doing projects with videos, things that they could actually take into their home that would lead them to do some exercise. And since we know that art's not very important, in all seriousness, art is a wonderful way of beginning to bring people together and to share things, both artistically, but also in terms of historically with the elderly, to have them bring forward some kind of memorabilia, a painting, or something that has meaning in their life. And then having your students begin to create artistic kinds of things that can bring them together. A lot of the women may know how to do knitting, they may know how to do other kinds of things. I know my own personal life, unfortunately my wife passed away a few months ago, and I've been going to the sport group, And one of the women in the support group does what they call memory bears. And they take clothing from the deceased person and they make a teddy bear that you can give to your grandchild or to a daughter or something like that. And so there are a lot of artistic opportunities to begin to do things that are very satisfying. Getting near the end, I would encourage you, everybody here is for the most part from Lingnan, but from any institution, I always say, look at your vision statement and your mission statement. If you're an academic institution, you ought to have some evaluation system in place to say, are we accomplishing what our university is supposed to be about? And this is what Lingnan says it's about, distinguished by outstanding teaching, learning, scholarship, and community engagement. So in your service learning programs, if you're at Lingnan and you want to be in the vision, you need to have teaching, learning, and scholarship. So what is the scholarship going to be in your service learning program? So it could be, again, the evaluation component I would suggest is a natural in terms of starting to be able to report, produce articles, academic articles about the kind of work that you're doing. And the three things in the mission: nurturing students, all-around excellence, core values, faculty and students contribute through research and knowledge. Again, going back to the evaluation piece that I'm trying to suggest you do, you can meet the goal of Lingnan University, because that's what they say. They want you to graduate students who can do these things. And you need high quality, and you need to be, as I'm suggesting, you need service learning in order to do all the things that Lingnan says it's supposed to be about. And lastly, we need to get back to this notion from Confucius and lots of others that we need to teach for wisdom, not knowledge. We need to talk about how you use knowledge and you use it in a socially constructive way to make the world a better place. Okay, so we've come, how are we doing? We have about 12, 13 minutes. As an evaluator, I always ask the same question whenever I do presentations. So would you have been better off spending an hour and a half playing video games? Or what did you get out of this? What's different now than at 10 o'clock when we started, besides maybe you're hungry for lunch? What's your takeaway? What are the things that you think are made the presentation of some value? Nothing?
I think the case study that we did was really good because
I think the case study that you asked us to do was really good, especially our groups. We have students, we have staff, and we have academics from another part of the world. So we contribute together and we try to think from different perspectives. And furthermore, you also have some suggestions that we could think deeper, not just the service, as you just mentioned. It's not just the service we think they need food or better electronic appliances. They may need something more. Although one of the things we also suggest is to have dialogue, but you have put more suggestions and examples, which is really food for thoughts. Thank you.
So in some ways I should talk less and we have more interaction, but it's nice to hear that, because part of my goal is to model what the discussion would look like, so that you can take this activity and go back home and do it with your students and do it with the community members, because it's a process. Okay, others? Let's see.
First of all, thanks again for your seminar. And I have a question. When you are talking about the engagement, it seems like doing something for the communities, maybe helping them, the needy people. The other thing is talking about. You also talk about the connected, which is a more neutral word. But what I'm thinking, I have a puzzle, is the other side, which just the self-reflection for the students. I'm not sure whether you would classify it as service learning or what. If the course is helping the student to have a self-reflection. Like nowadays, some citizens, they have a high rate of suicide, yeah, in the society. So what may be just the course making up some elements, helping them to self-reflection. Nowadays, people are talking about the positive thinking, some ethical education also. I'm not sure whether this would be a service learning also. Yeah.
That's a great question, because the notion of self-reflection and growth, again, going back to the mission statement, I've been doing an evaluation of a career and technical program in New Jersey for 6 years. And one of the elements that I include are called reflective journals. So every month, participants reflect on what they're learning, what they're doing, and in all the courses that I teach, I require journals from students. We call it civic portfolios. And so you can construct, if I were running Lingnan, I might talk about first-year students beginning to have a reflective portfolio that will monitor their 4 years at Lingnan that talks about what the mission statement says it's about. So to have them talk about how they've grown in their core values, have them talk about how each course has helped them to have a better understanding of the community and the challenges, so that you would actually have a written dialogue on the part of the student to say, we want you to be a reflective person when you leave this institution, and we're giving you a model of how to do that. That's just one example. And so how you develop that kind of reflective component is really up to you. But I think that the important part is that you need to have some kind of opportunity. And to make it more academic, we've developed reflective journals where we actually ask them to reflect on some of the concepts in the class. So we would say, what are you learning about the elderly? What are you learning about the social networks and the concept of social capital? And then we can say, and how are you using social capital in your own life? So what kind of connections are you making? Because when you talk to people, college, especially college students who hope to have some kind of employment, one of the advantages of doing community-based work is it expands their network. You also may find to have them do studies, sociologists have been doing this, a lot of people, in terms of the social network difference between old people or poor people and wealthy people. There was a very famous study in the early 1980s called The Strength of Weak Ties. And basically this person had said that people find jobs like bank tellers and a lot of those level jobs from a friend of a friend. But people who are getting executive jobs only get those by direct connection. And so that's a concept of sociology. And so you can begin to have your journal reflect some of the core academic areas that Lingnan thinks is important in Dora, because they talk about core values in the vision. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but it's important to get that. You can also do that of the community people, or getting middle school students, for example, to work with the elderly so that the middle school students do the writing, because the elderly don't want to write any journals. And so then they get some writing experience and they begin to create relationships. So some of the students that I've worked with over the years, I now have a daughter in China and granddaughter here, because they adopted me. And so you can build relationships. And it's a whole different world when you have a personal relationship with somebody. A couple of other points and then we can wrap up. What other kind of takeaways do you have? So modeling this kind of activity, doing some kind of reflective process. What else?
I'm really impressed how much emphasis you put in terms of evaluation on the community. I think in Hong Kong, the service learning program still, we didn't put enough effort in taking care of the impact of the community. We put a lot of time and effort in terms of running the course and on the students' learning, but we sort of we don't have enough time or emphasis on the impacts of the communities. So I really appreciate your emphasis.
If you read the preface of this book that you heard from Tim Stanton and Dwight Giles, they conclude by saying, where is the wisdom in service learning? It's in the community. We need to pay more attention to the wisdom of the community. Going back to that notion of scholars collaborating with farmers, one of the things that Bill Ramsey talks about is not only reciprocity, but acknowledging the fact that people who live lives outside of academies have knowledge. And we need to respect that knowledge. Because in many organizations that I've worked with around the world, when you develop community meetings and you invite community people, they often don't speak because they feel I'm stupid and you're smart, why would I say something? Or even within their groups, the ones who are shy don't say anything, and the people who are really outgoing say things. And so one of the goals is trying to figure out how do we respect and dignify every human being's life. Because I was going to ask, I said, how many of you are teachers? And if you raise your hands, how many of you are faculty? If you raise your hands, and then I ask the question, how many of you are human beings? And maybe 80% would raise their hands. But one of the goals of service learning, in its largest sense, is to treat all people as human beings. And to say, does the life of a woman that we just read about, is that as important as the life of the premier and the chair of the country, or the president of the university? So that kind of dignity is something that's very difficult to create. And going back to what Tim talked about, and what I'm trying to suggest is it takes a lot of time, and it takes relationships. In fact, John Dooley, who's the 95-year-old who wrote in this book, he said the most critical thing that we need to address is affect. Affect. Feelings are more important. I don't know if you've ever read Tom Friedman's book called The World is Flat. Friedman wrote this book about the 21st century, and he has this formula, and I'll leave it. He says that PQ plus CQ is greater than IQ. What do you think the P stands for? Passion. Got it. Passion. So the passion quotient plus the CQ, what's the C stand for? Curiosity. So he's suggesting that if you can create a curious and passionate individual, you'll have a lifelong learner. So 4 years at Lingnan may be helpful, but hopefully your life will be a lot longer than that. So how do you continue learning throughout your life? You need to have passion, and you need to have some creativity. And when I was having dinner with Tim last night, I've known Tim for over 30 years, you know, we keep saying, we're in our 70s, a lot of people are retiring, we should quit. Mine's starting to escape. And part of it is a passion. A passion to say, I've been involved in this for a long time, and finding out who I am. I'm a person whose name was not the name of my grandparents. My grandparents were immigrants from Russia. So we're all Asians, right? Well, you're Asian and I'm Caucasian. Isn't that kind of Asian? But in all seriousness, so my family went back a few generations, and members of my family were being killed because they belonged to a particular group that people hated. And so when I would work in areas of African American and Latino students, and we would talk about what do we have in common? And they would say, you're a white guy. How could people not like you? I said, well, you know, in some parts of the world, there are certain white guys that get killed because of who they are. And so part of my passion, I'm assuming, comes a little bit from my grandfather. that I don't want people to hate one another. I don't want people who are immigrants to be treated like they shouldn't be there. And so you can figure out what your own passion is. But if you can develop your passion, and we talk about this in the career and technical world, if you can find something you love to do and somebody to pay you to do it, you'll never work a day in your life. And our goal is hopefully that you'll never work a day in your life. But what you will do will be the kind of thing that the activity itself is what the reward is. Because as you get older, money doesn't matter. A lot of things don't matter. It's friendships and relationships that matter. And so if you can remember that, curiosity and passion are more important than intellect. I think it will help a lot in terms of reaching out to people, because you can reach them at the passion level. You create friendships and relationships. Any other final comments or concerns?
I have one more question about the resources management. How do you think the resources mainly should be provided by the community partner or by school or whatever?
Well, no. My bias, again, as I said in my history of 25 different careers, one of them that's most important is that when I directed the clearinghouse and when I was a librarian, it really gave me insight into the importance of sharing information and having information accessible. And so we're in the 21st century, you have websites and all of those kinds of things. Campus Compact, which is 1,100 universities in the United States, have a website. And so if you wanted to find out what do sociology faculty do in their courses, you could go to their website. When we were developing the Service Learning Clearinghouse website, we wanted it to be one-stop shopping. If you had any questions about service learning, you logged onto that website, and you'd either find the direct information or we'd connect you to another website. And the goal is really to understand that expertise is everywhere. You have zillions of people here in Hong Kong who really are experts on service learning, on evaluation. You have great community organizations. The more you can share that information, and that's what you were talking about, was getting your journalists. And one of the ways to do a clearinghouse would be actually to have your students do it. Create a course on what are service learning resources available to students at Lingnan or at your university, and then have the students do it. And then they could go out to the different communities and they can say, if you're in community X, where are the social workers? Get your geography students. Where are the maps? Where do you go? Because the more we can share information with one another, the more effective we'll be. So it's a great question. It's just a matter, we haven't figured out how to get it into the institution as part of our academic program. Okay. Any other? Yes, that means we're open.
Thank you, Dr. SHUMER, for your inspiring words and your further explanation. And also, I believe everyone here can absorb all these essential ways and strategies and apply them in the future. Most importantly, we can all spread the high quality of service learning out and serve our society in a more effective way. Lastly, may I invite Ms. Constance Chan, Teaching Fellow of Office of Service Learning, to give a conclusion of today. Ms. Chan, please.
Thank you. Once again, thank you, Dr. SHUMER, to give such inspiring workshop to us. And actually today, I'm very impressed by the atmosphere for today, because all of us come from different high education institution, and also our students as well as some friends from Taiwan. Yeah, we can share different point of views towards service learning. And actually, I was quite inspired from some points in today, especially the rituals of education and its implication on service learning. We are, all of us are educators, yeah, and we pay most of our heart
and also effort in helping students to integrate their academic knowledge into the community. And also, the other point is about the relationship about wisdom and knowledge. You know, nowadays, actually, most of the knowledge can be learned from books, internet, or from other people. But the wisdom, we can just learn them in the community and in the practice. Yeah, this is very important for us to aware that actually we should encourage the student not only focus on the knowledge, but also should learn much from the other people. This is the wisdom of learning, because you know, every people in the community are the expert in their life, as well as the community. And I think also more important is about the curiosity and passion. How to encourage our students to keep their curiosity and passion about the service and also the contribution to the society. I think this is our mission of education. Yeah. Tomorrow we will have a very inspiring event as well. Yeah. Today we also have my good friend. My good friend. This is Dr. Fan Yahui Jiao from National Pingtung University. She will lead an open space workshop for us. The workshop will be taking place in Dream Impact, which is a co-working space in Lai Chi Kok. Yeah, we have already invited different friends from other universities, as well as some friends from startup, and also some students to join the workshop. You are invited to join us as well. Yeah. Tomorrow the workshop will be start at 9:30. Yeah. It will be a whole day workshop. Hope we can make more inspire and also stimulation in the section to address the needs of the society. Yeah. Looking forward to see you tomorrow. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the OSL, we appreciate everyone who has participated in the discussion today. Your contribution has certainly turned our section into a more comprehensive and constructive one. Before we finish today's section, may I